If you're anything like me, one of the players that got you into playing guitar was none other than Stevie Ray Vaughan. He's one of my all-time favorite guitar players. I still listen to his music and just hear everything that he does, and I'm just in awe and just totally revere him, not only as a player, but just the tones that he got were just absolutely insane. But I've always wondered, because there was only a couple of years of overlap between when Stevie Ray died and when I was born, I wondered what gear would he be using if he were still alive now. Today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a deep dive into some of Stevie Ray's gear and then take a look at what some of the more contemporary players are using that kind of carried on a lot of the legacy of Stevie Ray Vaughan. Guys like Phillip, Sayce, Doyle, Bramhall, John Mayer, Kenny Wayne Shephard. All these players kind of carried on some of the sonic legacy of Stevie Ray Vaughan, and of course we're big fans of his, and kind of look at some of the gear that they were using, and then also kind of how Stevie Ray Vaughan's gear was sort of shifting up until the time of his death, and maybe put together kind of a approximate list of maybe where he would have gone given the stuff that's available today and the direction that he was going up until his untimely death. So let's do it. Let's start first with the gear that Stevie Ray Vaughan is most known for using. Of course, it's the Stratocaster, the beat the heck Stratocaster that, you know, everybody wanted to have some version of. I know that I wish I could have gotten one of those custom shop versions that was a one-to-one replica. I have a Roy Gallagher, which is sort of similar aesthetically to what that would have looked like, but an absolutely super cool looking Strat. That, of course, is always in the picture. There were other Stratocasters as well. The one that he played Lenny with, which is kind of like a 50s style Strat, red body, maple neck. Every once in a while, you'd see a 335 on some of the covers of the albums, even sometimes live, and also some of the Charlie's guitars that he had built by Charlie Wirtz in Dallas. Those were also things that would pop up, especially more toward the end. I know that I read toward the end there, his Strat only had limited amount of life left on it. It had been refretted so many times that a lot of other guitars were coming into the mix, not only sonically because he liked them, but also because he needed to sort of minimize some of the wear and tear on his #1 Strat. Pedal-wise, it was always pretty simple. Of course, there was always some version of a tube screamer. Sometimes it was a TS9, sometimes it was a TS10, also depended on the era. You'd always see some sort of maybe Vox, Clyde McCoy, or a Script Wah would be on there. There was also often a Leslie on stage, sometimes Univibes, sometimes you would see some fuzzes or octaves. Definitely there were times where you saw some of those Roger Mayer shaped boxes on the floor. So certainly a revolving door of a few items, but pretty pared down, pretty minimalistic. And then of course with the amps, there was a revolving door of a lot of them coming through. Early days, of course, you would have the Fenders, the classic Super Reverb and Vibroverb, but later on in his career got into using some of the Dumbles with the Steel String Singer, also the Marshall Major, and you'd see that in combination with a lot of different amplifiers, and you'd also see that big splitter that Cesar Diaz had made him so that multiple amps could be on at the same time. Now, I think most of us acknowledge and probably know fairly well, in even more detail than I went into there, about what the exact gear was that Stevie Ray Vaughan used, but I think for the most part, we can reliably say that those were kind of cornerstones of the gear. Fender style amps, whether that's Dumble or Marshall Major or whatever, it was typically more of a scooped out amp, big fat low end, had the tube screamer to kind of balance out some of that mid-range, had typically a single coil Stratocaster, a little bit more of a scooped out pickup set. That was kind of the magic combination of Stevie Ray Vaughan, plus those amps were really, really loud, really, really cooking. And then you'd have some other sort of select effects that would come in, you know, for Cold Shot, you'd have kind of that rotary sound. Also, when you're hearing Voodoo Child or something like that, you were getting some wah, but effects overall, fairly minimal. Now, the other thing that should be acknowledged is right up until the time of his death, Stevie Ray was experimenting with some new stuff. Obviously, the Dumble had come into the picture by that point. Also, a Soldano SLO had come into the picture at that point, and although there isn't any definitive answer on how it was used, even by Mike Soldano, he knows that Stevie Ray received it and from all reports liked it, but it hadn't yet been used at all in any sort of, you know, live gigging context. But if we're looking at a lot of his contemporaries, guys like Eric Clapton, people that were kind of on that same artist roster that was introduced as Fender endorsing artists with Fender signature guitars, he was in that class of guitar players along with Robert Cray and Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton definitely got into bigger, more feature-laden rigs by that point in the late 80s, had started using a Soldano SLO as one of his mainstays in his rig. In fact, a dual Soldano SLO in parallel. We have a cool video on that if you want to check that out. Presumably, Stevie Ray could have been following a similar lineage as Eric Clapton. Maybe would have started involving a higher gain amp. But even we saw guys who were using Soldano SLOs that weren't using it necessarily in a high gain context, guys like Warren Haynes. So it is possible that Stevie Ray Vaughan might have gone down that pathway using a Soldano in some capacity in the rig. Equally, he had his signature Stratocaster that was just about to release. I don't know if that would have changed the types of guitars he was playing, but presumably when an artist launches a signature model, they're somewhat beholden to playing that guitar. And although I'm sure that we would have seen some of Charlie's guitars in there, you would have seen, of course, his #1 in there, I think we probably would have seen a whole lot more of the signature Stratocaster showing up in live performances, and would have had more of that classic Texas special pickup sound, and who knows what that would have spun off with in terms of other guitars, signature guitars through Fender, whether that would have had other custom shop models that would have come out much sooner than the one-to-one replicas did. There's really no way of knowing, but I think it's important to name that that was sort of the trajectory of kind of the surrounding environment of Stevie Ray Vaughan, with Eric Clapton, a guy who was equally developing a signature model with Fender, definitely played a lot of those, definitely got a Soldano, and that became a main part of his tone. I think that that was something in a direction that a lot of people were going. They were in a kind of a similar circle as Stevie Ray Vaughan. Now that we've acknowledged what Stevie used and kind of the trajectory that he was on, I want to think about players that kind of carried on the lineage of Stevie Ray Vaughan. So this isn't saying that these are players that are better than Stevie Ray Vaughan or that took over for Stevie Ray Vaughan, but kind of developed their sound and their careers, certainly inspired by the work that Stevie Ray Vaughan did and his tones and the gear that they used, and maybe how that might have influenced Stevie should he have still been around. But these players lived through multiple generations of boutique waves. A lot more pedals were available to them, so their choices were a lot broader than what Stevie Ray had available to him when he was coming up through the ranks. He was deciding what he liked. So I kind of want to look at what they were using and maybe sort of guesstimate on how this might have worked its way into Stevie's gear. Now, one of the first players that I want to highlight is Phillip Sayce, a great guitar player, one of my favorites of all time. If you don't know who Phillip is, definitely check him out. I'm going to put some links to his music below, so if you want to check out what he's doing, definitely do that. He definitely carried on the lineage of Stevie Ray Vaughan sonically. He has an incredible voice, and when you hear his guitar playing, it is just electric. The whole entire stage just becomes just like electrified and on fire with great tone. And some of the key pieces that Phillip used that are exactly the same as Stevie Ray Vaughan is he uses a vintage wah, just like Stevie Ray, has a lot of different wahs. In fact, I once did a little wah shootout with Phillip many years ago over at Mates in North Hollywood, and he is a wah fanatic and definitely goes all in on those vintage wahs, but equally uses a vintage TS-808, using a vintage style tube screamer just like Stevie Ray. A couple of ways where he departed though from the really traditional elements of Stevie Ray Vaughan is he uses a Klon. Now this is a pedal that wasn't around during the time of Stevie Ray Vaughan, but if we're looking at Phillip Sayce, and also if we're looking at Kenny Wayne Shepherd, or we're looking at John Mayer, this is a pedal that came into a lot of their rigs very soon after the Klon was released, or within maybe a decade or so became mainstays on their rig. I think we could definitely presume, given that context, that it's likely that Stevie Ray would have at least tried a Klon, if not be a staple on his rig. So it's definitely a consideration when we're thinking about how Stevie Ray Vaughan's rig might have evolved, given what some of these players that are in that style have chosen for their rigs. Equally, another thing that worked its way into Phillip's rig was the KR Mega Vibe. Now this was kind of the univibe of the day back in kind of the mid-2000s. Everybody had to have the purple big KR Mega Vibe. Sounded incredible. I remember having one. I remember repairing a lot of them and just thinking that they were absolutely incredible sounding vibes. Phillip has definitely been using this thing for many, many years, and it's definitely possible that this would have worked its way onto Stevie's rig over time. Another thing that we see a lot of these players using, especially Phillip Sayce, is he was really into that Line 6 green delay, and that was a ubiquitous piece on a lot of people's rigs back in that time. And I think that given that people were evolving musically, we might have eventually seen Stevie Ray get into some delay sounds. Certainly when you were listening to some of the David Bowie stuff, it's ambiguous which parts were exactly played by Stevie Ray and which parts were played by Nile Rodgers, but there definitely was some delayed guitar in some of those David Bowie records, especially around the time of Let's Dance. So maybe that would have been something that Stevie Ray would have played with a little bit later on in his career as he got into the 90s and 2000s. Maybe we would have seen a DL4 somewhere on that rig. Another thing you see on Phil Sayce's rig that perhaps would have ended up on Stevie Ray's is Cesar Diaz started making pedals, and as you know, Cesar Diaz was Stevie Ray's trusted tech. Cesar released some fuzzes and tremolo Presumably, he would have still been friends with Stevie Ray, and I bet Stevie probably would have wanted to give him a leg up, try some of those effects, maybe even feature those on his pedal board. So perhaps it's likely that Stevie would have also had some of those Cesar Diaz fuzzes and tremolo on his rig. But let's go to another player. Let's look at Doyle Bramhall. Again, another one of my favorite guitar players out there, just absolutely amazing. I've been following him since the Archangel days when he was playing with Charlie Sexton. If you don't know who Doyle Bramhall is, definitely check him out. I'm gonna have some links to his music in the description below. Now, Doyle has had a pretty monstrous rig almost his whole career. The first rig of his that I really saw was built over at True Tone Music in Santa Monica by Junior Garrison, an absolute monster, and had some great pedals on there. Had the Landgraf overdrives. Those are kind of early versions of kind of high quality modded tube screamers that had a lot of different options in terms of symmetrical and asymmetrical clipping and all sorts of cool TS style modded tones. I definitely think that the Landgrafs could have made their way onto his rig, but he also had one of those really cool early custom shop full tone Deja vibes, and those were absolutely amazing. And you can bet that Stevie Ray Vaughan would have been a big fan of the full tone stuff because he was really trying to do the vintage stuff but make it really accurate and really reliable, super robust. Nobody can ever claim that Mike Fuller isn't making absolute dynamite pedals that are absolutely rock solid. I think that could have definitely been something that ended up on Stevie Ray's rig for sure. And then kind of looking at some of the more modern Doyle Bramhall rigs, you saw the Zonk fuzzes on there. I think Stevie would have been into those. And you also see the Vibro, which is a really, really great reinterpretation of the original Chennai. I think as a vintage enthusiast, as Stevie Ray Vaughan was, I think you would have definitely seen some variation of that on the rig for sure. Equally with Doyle, you could see that he had some of those modded Oxbow wahs. Those are really, really great sort of vintage, authentic sounding wahs. I think you could have definitely assumed that he would have had something of that nature on there. Also in terms of rotary, Doyle on a lot of the early rigs was using the Hughes and Kettner Rotosphere. Now this was a huge tube-based rotary pedal that was used by guys like Charlie Hunter and John Mayer. This thing sounds absolutely insane. It's huge, hard to power, but absolutely sounds the part. You can bet that something like that definitely would have ended up on a Stevie Ray Vaughan rig at some point in time, should he have survived into the late 90s and early 2000s. And also you see some of those effects by Jessie Davey, things like the fuzz, things like the dualist or the soloist. These are all great Stevie Ray Vaughan type effects. And if you listen to Jessie Davey play, you can just hear that he also oozes Stevie Ray Vaughan tone, just absolutely killer guitar player, makes great effects. And you can see guys like Doyle really lend themselves to those sorts of effects because they just sound the part, they act the part, they feel the part. And for people that want to get kind of a modern version of a tube screamer that has multiple channels on it, really, really nails kind of the glassiness of Stevie Ray Vaughan's tone, but adds that mid-range of a tube screamer. I don't think you could go wrong with something like the Dualist to give you lots of flexibility and really get you in the zone with that Stevie Ray Vaughan tone. Let's go now to Kenny Wayne Shepherd. I think Kenny Wayne Shepherd is somebody to me that really stayed the closest rooted in the blues to any of the players that we're talking about in terms of kind of the traditionalness, the people that he was playing with. He's just a fantastic player, great tone, signature Fender guitar, just like Stevie Ray Vaughan. So they align in that particular fashion. But one thing that we see is that Kenny Wayne always was using a tube screamer. We had an Analog Man modified version that you could send in your tube screamer to get modded like Kenny Wayne Shepherd, make it a little bit more robust. But also you would see things like the King of Tone involved in his rig. You would also see the Klon involved in his rig. And again, kind of touching back, I think it's absolutely likely that Stevie Ray Vaughan definitely would have come into contact with the Klon at some point in his career. I think you might have even seen that King of Tone at some point in his career, because again, that does a really nice kind of blues breaker style overdrive like the original Marshall Blues Breaker. This is also something that you would see in John Mayer's rigs over the years, the original Marshall version, that the King of Tone is kind of emulating in a dual channel version. The other thing you see is instead of the Vibro, you see the new Sir Henry Univibes, and those are absolutely incredible. I have one here and they're absolutely amazing pedals. I think you can definitely bet that he would have had one of those on his rig, especially since the maker of that pedal was involved with the original Chennai Vibro, also as a technician for Eric Johnson and Kenny Wayne Shepherd. An amazing guy, really, really cool pedal, and is really, really well built. I think we definitely would have seen a Sir Henry on Stevie Ray's rig for sure. Now last, let's go to John Mayer. A big fan of Stevie Ray Vaughan for sure, admittedly a big fan of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And you can see on his rig, definitely always had a tube screamer. TS10, very similar, if not the same as what Stevie Ray Vaughan was using. also has the Klon. That was something that we talked about. A lot of players are using that kind of took up that torch of Stevie Ray Vaughan and carried it forward into the modern day. I think it's likely, as I said, we would have seen a Klon involved some way with Stevie Ray's rig. Another thing that we see on Mayer's rig, which I think is a little bit different, is we do see that John is experimenting more with things like boosts, either pre or post. He has a Keeley Katana, often that's used for pickup compensation up on the front end. We also sometimes see one on the back end that's used as kind of like an output boost to add more output and level to the overall signal. We've also seen experimentation with things like filter pedals and things like that. We've also seen some experimentation with delays, at least always having some sort of short slap back like the Aquapus there to add a little bit more body to the overall note. I don't know if Stevie Ray Vaughan would have went that direction, but I think it's definitely possible that we would have seen delay at some part in his career as he evolved. We could see that in other of his contemporaries like Eric Clapton using rack delays and things of that nature, especially on those Cornish rigs and those Bradshaw rigs that were built for him in the mid to late 80s. But I think overall, to just recap pedals, I think the consistent lines that we see across the board. Tube screamers are still very much overwhelmingly used. I think things like the King Tone Duelist, Soloist, those could be great alternatives that I think definitely would have been in the Stevie Ray Vaughan vein. And if you look at what Jessie Davey is doing and you hear him play, you just know that this guy knows Stevie Ray Vaughan tone without a doubt. I think the other thing that we can say confidently is that a Klon was likely going to be somewhere in the Stevie Ray Vaughan arsenal. All the players that carried that torch definitely were all using Klons either currently or at some point in their career. It's likely that that would have ended up on his rig. Another thing we can say confidently is vintage wahs probably would have stayed as is. Almost all these players use some version of a vintage wah or a very, very closely related or closely resembling one-to-one replica of a vintage kind of Clyde McCoy Vox style wah-wah. That definitely would have probably been something that would have continued. The other thing that we see, guys were using different versions of boutique Univibes. That could have been the KR Mega Vibe, that could have been the Vibe Bro, that could have been the Sir Henry. I think it's likely that Stevie would have migrated to one of those for reliability and ease of use on the road. Equally, we would have seen probably some introduction of his friend Cesar Diaz and Tech, Cesar Diaz's pedals. This could have been in the form of a fuzz. This could have been in the form of the tremolo. Also, rotary, lots of great stuff had come out. I think the Hughes and Kettner was definitely the best one. Even my buddy Zapata still uses the Hughes and Kettner Rotosphere. It sounds so good. It was a part of Doyle Bramhall signature sound, and a lot of players were really into it. They were into kind of that really accurate sounding Univibe that didn't necessitate them having a Leslie on stage. It would have been likely for travel purposes and for touring that might have been more practical for somebody like Stevie. Lastly, I think delays would have worked their way in at some point. People just started using more delays, and even if it was a basic slapback like an Aquapus or a DM2 style or a carbon copy, that might have been there. He might have even gone crazier and got a multi-effect delay like Phillip Sayce had or Doyle Bramhall had in those early days with the DL4, a classic that was ubiquitous in the industry for many, many years. But enough about the pedals. Let's move to guitars. And I think that this is actually kind of a no-brainer, because if we're looking at Mayer, we're looking at Kenny Wayne Shepherd, we're looking at Doyle Bramhall, we're looking at Phillip Sayce. These guys are all using Strats pretty much as their primary guitars. They have a few other things here and there, but really you're just using Stratocaster or Stratocaster bass guitars if we're talking about the Silver Sky in the case of John Mayer. But overall, we're all talking about 3 single coil pickups, solid body, bolt-on neck, typically a rosewood fingerboard with a maple neck. That's pretty consistent across the board. I think we can fairly confidently say we would still expect Stevie Ray Vaughan to be playing a Strat. His contemporaries, guys like Robert Cray, guys like Eric Clapton that were in that kind of signature guitar group, that first kind of alumni group of signature guitar players that were part of Fender's lineup, all those guys still Strat players. It's likely we would have still seen Stevie play a Strat. Lastly, let's talk about amps. Now, when I'm thinking about guys like Mayer, he's definitely gone all in on the Stevie Ray Vaughan thing. He has the steel string singer. He's got some big Fender amps like Vibro Verbs. He's also got 2 Rocks that have been in the mix at different points, also kind of doing that, big, clean, fat sound. We look at Phillip Sayce. He's got that Cougar amp. He's got the mother, the big steel string singer style clean amp, takes pedals great, definitely in that Dumble vibe. Doyle Bramhall, he's using 2 Rocks, definitely again in that Dumble vibe. Kenny Wayne Shepherd is actually using Fender modified Dumbles or actual Dumbles now for almost all of his new stuff, and definitely has been a Fender guy for much of his life. Again, I think we can pretty confidently say that Stevie would have stayed in that Fender zone. Maybe the Soldano would have come into play at some point, maybe for the lead tone. We're not really sure, but I think that still we would have seen the overarching sound somehow being related to that classical Fender sound. Also, it's likely he would have been splitting out to all these multiple amps. We still see John Mayer doing that. And although Cesar Diaz doesn't produce a box, it's like a 4 or 5-way amp splitter. Jessie Davey actually does produce one that is a mirror image of what Stevie Ray Vaughan used to use. So if you're interested in getting a splitter like that, definitely head over to his site. I'll link it in the description below, and you can get one of those splitters if you want to emulate that multiple amp setup where Stevie Ray had a lot of different amps that were all going at once to kind of fill in different frequencies. So that was my guesstimate as to what Stevie Ray Vaughan might have been using should he have still been alive, and using some iconic players that would have carried the torch for Stevie Ray and would have continued that legacy of high quality, really, really great blues music, great tones, Strats, Fender amps, mid-range boosted tube screamers all together to just make this beautiful tone that we all know and love. It's what got me into playing guitar. It still inspires me to play the guitar. And I think it was a really great process to get back and think to Stevie Ray Vaughan's tone, think about some of his gear, and then how it might have evolved over the years. But I'd really love to hear from you about things that you think that might have been involved in his gear should he have still been alive today, what pedals he might have used, what amplifiers he would have used if he would have still been playing a Stratocaster. I'd love to hear your hot takes, your theories, so please do put those in the description below. And if you like what you saw today, I highly recommend that you like and you subscribe. It'll keep you all up to date with all the latest and greatest stuff just by hitting that bell icon. So please do that now if you haven't already. And if you want to support, definitely go over to therigdr.com. We sell all of our pedalboard supplies and materials there. Or if you want to support us by buying one of our pedals, head over to vertexeffects.com. We sell all of our pedals, our pedal boards, all available there. And if you want to hear a little bit longer form, maybe on your commute to work, you can join us on our podcast on all the popular podcatchers, Spotify, Apple. So you can listen to us there while you're commuting to or from work and get to hear a little bit longer form where we're interviewing other artists, we're interviewing other pedalboard builders, so you can get a sense of some of the other things that we're up to through the podcast. And if you want to check out any of the pedals or the builders that we mentioned that are making complementary SRV style sounding gear, definitely check those out in the description as well. Until next time, I am Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka The Rig Doctor. I'll see you later.